In the final week before the State Duma's summer recess, Russian lawmakers rammed through some curious legislation, including several initiatives the authorities would apparently like to roll out now, before Putin's re-election campaign presumably kicks off in the fall. Notably, Duma deputies voted to adopt draft amendments that raise the maximum age for conscription, widening the Army's demographic pool of men and adding an additional 1.5 million soldiers by 2025. Initially, military leaders talked about coupling this reform with a hike to the minimum age for conscription, raising it from 18 to 21. But lawmakers ditched the idea and kept the maximum age jump from 27 to 30. Deputies also abandoned early plans to make these changes gradually in phases. Another reform that slipped into the State Duma's last-minute legislative burst was an amendment that empowers the president to charge governors with the creation of special militarized formations during periods of mobilization, wartime, and martial law. These new groups, controlled by the state but separate from the military, will be yet another factor in Russia's complicated civil-military relations, a subject that's gained even more global attention in the aftermath of last month's mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner Group mercenaries. So let's talk about the specialized enterprises forged in this new legislation and explore what such a project says about the current relationship between the military and everything else in Russia. Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy folks, I'm your host Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Meduza's English language edition. On today's show, we're welcoming back Kirill Shemyev, a Russian political scientist and a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He was on the show at the top of the month to talk about Prigozhin's mutiny, and clearly I just didn't get enough of him, so I begged him to return when I saw the news about these specialized military formations. But first, a few words about these groups as they're described in the legislation that's just passed the State Duma. They will assist law enforcement agencies and perform several tasks, including things like maintaining public order and ensuring public safety, sounds nice, defending Russia's borders, okay, and combating illegal armed formations and the sabotage reconnaissance groups of foreign states. When necessary, they are permitted to shoot down drones, so the next Ukrainian attack on Moscow or some other city could very well be their fault. This means, of course, that these men will be armed, presumably by the National Guard, and typically only to guard various government facilities. The legislation does spell out rare circumstances where members of these formations can actually open fire on a crowd of people. And just as this legislation emerged from nowhere and sped through voting in the State Duma, Carnegie Politica published a fascinating essay by Kirill Shemyev titled Suspensions, Detentions, and Mutinies, the Growing Gulf in Russia's Civil-Military Relations. All about the trade-offs between loyalty and competence in the armed forces that the Kremlin has to juggle. When I spoke to Kirill, I started off with questions about his insights in this essay, and the conversation grew into a narrower look at the specialized formations that I described just a minute ago. At the core of your recent essay, you point out that a lot of people claim that the issues with Russian civil-military conflict, it all just boils down to the president's preference for loyalty over competence. And this is what you often see whenever the Russian military fails at anything. It's like, oh, well, that's because Putin's like, he meddles too much in the military and he's just picking the loyal people and not picking the competent ones. And you argue that it's actually more complicated than that. Why?
Just in terms of civil-military relations, the most important aspect is to secure loyalty of armed personnel, because these armed personnel is created and they're functioning for the state and on behalf of the state. And when you have especially troops with heavy weapons, if we even make a claim that they are disloyal, this is like a kegel of explosives under the political stability. So loyalty is always a priority for, well, I would say maybe for any more or less functional state, because as we say, as sometimes I say in Russian, против танка нет приема. If you're a civilian or you don't have heavy weaponry, you can't do anything against a tank. So that's why loyalty is really important for when we think about civil-military relations. But at the same time, the Kremlin wants to win the war, sometimes somehow end it in preferable conditions. And for that, they need competence. For the commander-in-chief, there is a very difficult kind of balancing act between, on the one hand, ensure that everybody is loyal to him and to the state, and they won't, what Prigozhin did, start a mutiny or rebellion. But on the other hand, increase their effectiveness. And sometimes, as we know, in order to increase effectiveness, you need to fire some people or, make some personal decisions or some decisions that would be unpopular. So it's a really, this is the art of politics and probably civil military relations. This kind of balancing it out and finding a proper balance, which I think, Kremlin is not so capable of,
Mm.
especially the Wagner's mutiny has shown us to us.
Would you say that I mean, this is somewhat counterintuitive, but because the Russian military it seems to be very worried about loyalty problems or disloyalty, I guess. Would it be fair to say that the Putin regime actually tolerates higher disloyalty in the military than maybe some democracies do? Because I mean, even the idea of even the hint of a mutiny for instance, the American military would be like, insane. Whereas for months, Prigozhin was allowed to criticize the military, and there was public infighting and so on, and Putin never intervened. So I mean, from that perspective, you might even say, oh well, Putin's actually got higher tolerance for disloyalty because he is so desperate for competence. Is that a fair way of looking at it at all, or am I going off in a weird direction?
I would agree with you that in like democratic countries, when if Prigozhin said that the first criticism toward the military in a democratic country, probably the federal prosecutor, members of parliament would have already started an investigation, a hearing, and this conflict would have been at least institutionalized, like channeled through proper institutional mechanism. And because Russia is a like personal dictatorship, it was all out in public, like a volcano, and
Mhm.
no one could take control over it. I think here with Putin, I think, well, it's a big, again, criminology, but in my view, he really, considering that Prigozhin has been his long lasting ally, he was trusting him. And also, it was a bit useful for him because Wagner, his criticism brought what we say in academia, reduced information asymmetry. This criticism was bringing alternative information to the Kremlin in terms of the status of armed forces, what they do, and so on. And of course, they needed this force, as we remember, for the assault in Bakhmut. So, from the operational perspective, probably the Kremlin was kind of trying to slow down as much as possible this kind of criticism and hoping that Prigozhin would do nothing about it. But politicians make mistakes. In Russia's history, well, there was a similar incident. Just I'm now thinking of 1941, when Stalin, as like a personal dictator, was also there was lots of intelligence reports, and everyone was basically saying that the Germans would attack, and Stalin did nothing, and probably he was hoping for something else. And maybe we have a sort of zero point 0.1 case similar here, luckily, with of course significantly less consequences in terms of human losses and everything.
Serdyukov's reforms. I know that's something you mentioned in the article, and that was another question I had actually. Is you talk about his tenure as being the time when Russia imposed institutional changes that improved Russian military capabilities, and to describe it as sort of a deviation from what's been standard across the Putin era. I mean, I remember reading about Serdyukov kind of being this like civilian outsider who's coming in and doing stuff, and then he has a love affair and some problems, and he leaves sort of in disgrace. But what was so special about his tenure? What makes him as a defense minister stand out?
His tenure was special first because he was the first real civilian minister of defense in Russia's history. Then, second, that he implemented very radical changes that a lot of people inside the Ministry of Defense and among military service members in the defense industry and at the FSB, for example, strongly objected. They really like disliked. Some criticism was fair because of course he made mistakes, and the way he implemented these decisions, especially during the first 2 years, were quite radical and disrespectful, just on basic human level to senior generals, for instance. But also because yes, he broke this tradition, this more conservative tradition, post-Soviet kind of past dependency that existed in the Russian military, and made the Russian military basically created these structural changes that made the Russian military more agile, flexible, adaptable. Basically, he created the foundation of the armed forces we saw in the annexation of Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, the semi-limited invasion in Syria. Basically, what started all this fuss about the growing Russian military capabilities. The Serikov built the foundation for that, and also he kicked off the rearmament program that Shoigu was to implement, and that's important because he basically helped to lobby for this trillions of rubles to bring new tanks, aircrafts, missiles to the Russian military. And then Shoigu kind of got this package and had to keep going and kind of implementing and bringing stuff to the forces. So yeah, his ousting was also quite spectacular. He was charged with, I think, with corruption, with multiple cases of corruption, and especially people around him. He was also obviously they started to what the war here to delegitimize him in state media,
Mm,
show his like love affairs and everything. And then when Putin came back to the Kremlin, he kind of fired him. Well, not fire him, but because of the criminal cases, he made him resign.
mm,
So and that's how his kind of public famous tenure ended.
right.
But then, in fact, he didn't go to prison. He was appointed to a very nice position in the Russian defense industry. So he basically he's been living a nice life since
Right.
his
Hmm.
dismissal.
Okay. Another thing that you write in the article is that Putin has been, and this is something I've seen many places described in various sort of different ways, but it's usually kind of the same vibe, is that Putin has been reluctant to use his political capital to perform his sort of role as a moderator or an intervening force between like warring clans and so on. And that when it comes to civil military relations, he hasn't stepped in when he should have. And this is the most dramatic example of him failing to do this is the Wagner mutiny. Do you think that Putin learned his lesson, or do you think he, based on what you've seen, because obviously he met with Prigozhin. Prigozhin is apparently in St. Petersburg today, meeting with some of the visiting African dignitaries. He's not. When the whole thing was happening, I thought, okay, Prigozhin's going to be murdered by the end of this. They're going to kill him. And then when they sent him to Belarus, it was like, well, I guess he's sort of imprisoned in Belarus. But no, he's still, going around. What do you think in terms of Putin and his reluctance to spend his political capital to mediate in these conflicts, specifically in the civil military sense? Do you think he's learned a lesson of some kind here, or he's just going about everything the same way?
Yeah, my answer would be with that we don't know because yeah, indeed what's happening during the last months it's really puzzling
Hmm.
because I was expected that Prigozhin would be at least imprisoned or something would happen to him. Maybe not now, but at least there would be signs that they're kind of going after him. And now we see these absolutely bizarre from the military perspective pictures of him in St. Petersburg, right? I just can't imagine what some generals think of. Well, of their place in the system if a person who basically killed 13 of their pilots is now free and hanging around with African leaders. But going back to your question about Putin's role, well, even if I get the fact that Russia has been becoming and now is a personal dictatorship, even if it was a democracy, still in the civil military domain and military, there's a very important vertical chain of command that's kind of comes from top to bottom, the commander in chief as the president, and then Minister of Defense, Chief of General Staff, and going down to the individual soldiers. And then, considering that the Russian system is very personalized, the role of the commander in chief, hence the president, is very important both in, for example, regulating defense affairs, regulating this conflict, basically making a decision, setting up coordination bodies so that people like argue pragmatically and without huge conflicts that kind of spilling over into the political sphere. And of course, the same on the battlefield. The president has to control, and it's his job to keep the system functioning. And well, the PMC Wagner under Prigozhin, it was like an alien body in the Russian civil military relations. It's very new. It has been like this completely informal and but also quite powerful paramilitary force, only connected through some vague channels to the political leadership, and there was some kind of coordination with the official military. And this created friction or tensions, especially when he started criticizing the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff. Again, military generals can also even agree with this criticism. But the fact of speaking out and going public, politicizing this is something completely inappropriate. Again, as I said before, for the military, you have to obey. You may have your own opinion. If you disagree, resign. Well, now it's difficult, but at least before the mobilization, or there are informal ways, you can slow down the implementation of orders, the execution of orders. But going public is something that is both legally, institutionally, but also culturally something that like you shouldn't do.
Hmm.
And it all ended up in a mutiny and a crisis of crisis, right? And this is a failure of Putin's leadership as a in chief, but also huge blow to the Russian civil military relations. Well, because of losses, because of the break of the chain of command and criticism towards the military leadership. And now we see that this, I actually think, in my view, this crisis is ongoing because, again, there's no retribution. Prigozhin is free. Wagnerites are apparently they're going to Africa from Belarus, and so what's next, right?
Right.
How can this conflict settle down?
Hmm. I wanted to pivot now to this new legislation that just passed the State Duma. They adopted this legislation that will create new armed formations that they're calling specialized enterprises, and it seems like it's a cross between like a private security company and then maybe even like Russia's territorial defenses. Once the law is in effect, the president will have the power to order governors to create these things, and then the National Guard will apparently arm them. How do you see these new units fitting into the larger picture? Because it seems like on one hand, it gives the National Guard even another tool in the aftermath of the mutiny, and they've been getting, now they have heavy equipment, and so it seems like it's part of just building up the National Guard in one respect. But it's also strange, like why are the authorities going about it like this? Why are they creating another weird sort of hybrid group? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think lots of people, I saw this on Twitter, lots of people immediately saw this as feudalization of Russia as the kind of first signs of
Right.
Russia's
There was
disintegration.
the something like they're going backwards from communism to capitalism to feudalism.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that I'm worried about this as well, but I think it's still more, we have to see more, especially when it comes to the government regulations of this amendment. So, just a brief overview how this Russian legal system functions. They introduced a very quick amendment during the last hearing of changes to the laws on defense and everything, where they kind of put this paragraph on territorial state-owned enterprises, defense like military enterprises, and it's quite vague. It's not that some stuff is not yet even specialized. For example, they say that the body that gives them weapons is like something federal, designated federal body or something. But I think most people assume it's the National Guard.
Right.
So we'll see more when the government rolls out its own regulations.
Hmm.
In my view, this is indeed quite dangerous in terms of giving more, at least on the informal level, kind of capital to the regional leaders. Because even if we assume that this control formally would be, for example, in the hands of the National Guard, operational control, or maybe the headquarters of special military operation, right, in from Rostov, so the military officers will command these state-owned private military, state-owned military companies. Still, these enterprises will be formed with people from the regions. They would bond as locals. Another important aspect that the provision, although it's specified it's a federal budget, but also the regions will be responsible for some part of logistics, for example, maybe housing and of these personnel, especially because when it comes to these state-owned enterprises, if they're formed on the regional level, it is actually the region that is legally responsible for their operations and like, material, logistical support and everything. This gives more opportunity for regional leaders to, again, as Prigozhin did, as we see with his mercenaries, who at least some of them are personally loyal to him. So this gives opportunities for regional leaders as well. But I think the government, the Kremlin's rationale here is to formalize the territorial defense forces and to create an organization that will let the government give to the territorial defense forces defense and streamline operation control over them. Because before that, basically, they did form some territorial defense units, but legally they couldn't give them weapons. And
Hmm.
of course, what can they do? Competence or something.
They don't have weapons. The territorial defenses. What are they carrying? Like batons, flashlights? Like what do they have? Who are these people?
It's Yeah, this is also quite vague. I think they formed these units, but this here I'm not sure. I think they haven't been really kind of deployed to the borders.
Like, yeah,
They
like
could.
Belgorod has like 3 or 6 thousand of these guys in like
Mhm.
one or two different units, and like I've never seen a
And
picture of them. Like, what do they look? Do they have
yeah,
uniforms? Like, what do they look like?
yeah, indeed. We haven't seen them in action, especially when, for example, even when the Ukrainian forces conducted some incursions in Russia's proper, and probably they were just training on the training fields, shooting practices, some tactical
Even though they
moves and
can't
everything
technically have weapons, they probably were.
on the shooting
Yeah,
ranges. Probably, I guess
yeah.
somehow informally, because even like school kids can sometimes shoot from military weapons.
More and more, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Okay.
it's, at least on the shooting ranges, yeah, I think it was possible. So now they have this legal option, and the National Guard probably will be responsible for giving the weapons. So yeah, some people also claim that they are sort of an anti-rebellion force.
Yeah.
I doubt, because of their just capabilities.
Right.
Well, in order to stop a rebellion, you need to have some real people with real like, military special forces probably experience,
Mhm.
especially if they're from the region and founded by the regional authorities. Probably they will be just located within the region, and so it's just administratively speaking, I think it would be quite difficult to use them if there is another mutiny like Prigozhin's
Mhm.
one. But
So
for example,
what would they use them for then?
in my view, again, what based on the information we have now, it's for the territorial defense in the borders close to Ukraine,
Mhm.
Belgorod, Kursk, Rostov, and all other regions.
Yeah.
But also, there was a special provision for Moscow. Moscow can form
And already
legally,
has formed
even
apparently.
has formed apparently, yes, and probably can form even more without president's approval.
Right.
This is also quite interesting. But here I'll have to go then in criminology and probably some maybe personal relations between Saddam and
Right,
Putin,
right, yeah.
which I don't know.
Yeah, if we were gonna
Yeah.
make a movie, we'd have to figure out how many stars to tattoo on the character's body or something. Thanks for tuning in, folks. This has been The Naked Pravda, a podcast from Meduza in English. Remember that undesirable status back in Russia means our entire news outlet now relies on readers and listeners around the world to support our work. Please visit our website for information about how to become a contributor with one-time or recurring pledges. Thanks again. Until next week.